Welcome to everyone. It's a privilege to be talking about Heschel as a prophetic voice against racism. Heschel was, among many other things, a poet, and he published a collection of poems in Yiddish in 1933 in Warsaw under the title Der Shem HaMeforosh Mensch. Translated into English and published all in English in 2004 by Rabbi Morton Leifman of blessed memory. The English title became The Ineffable Name of God, Man. And one of those poems is what we're going to begin with tonight, and you'll see why. The poem was titled in Yiddish, Gott's Tränen, which in English becomes God's Tears. And just before I put this up, I'll be putting a number of texts up, the text that you have a link to. What we're going to read from Heschel will feature words and expressions that we, and presumably he, would word differently today. I just want to, point that out to you. Things like exclusively male language for God, exclusively male language for human beings, not to mention the word Negro, which of course was the preferred term in the early to mid 60s. Just as an aside, for those of you who haven't seen it, you might want to see John McWhorter's very edgy column in today's New York Times Sunday Review for more on racial terminology, a very interesting and kind of edgy piece that the Times went out on a limb to publish. Anyway, I put up now this very short poem.
No, we don't need this breakout room. No, if it's for this breakout room, that's not.
That's not what we want here. Sometimes screen sharing is very strange. No, still not. Let me see here.
We also have a
should work now.
a link to your, okay.
No, it should work now. Here it is. Okay. So here's God's tears. God's tears lie on the cheeks of shamed, weak people. Let me wipe away his lament. He in whose veins there whirls a quiet shudder before God, let him kiss the nails of a pauper. To the worm crushed underfoot, God calls out, my holy martyr. The sins of the poor are more beautiful than the good deeds of the rich. Now, I don't want to really deal with that last line, which almost sounds like it could come from the Gospels. I think there's a better understanding of what Heschel is doing there, but that's not our focus. My focus here is on the very beginning of that poem. It's on the sense that comes through in this short poem that God has an emotional life and that God reacts in particular to the suffering of the oppressed. And we're going to see more of that as we go along. When this idea of God wiping away tears, he has in mind clearly a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 25, which says, that the Lord God is someday destined to wipe away the tears from every face, from every human face, that we won't be suffering anymore. But what Heschel does now is his transformation in this poem is to say, yes, there are tears on human faces, but you know whose tears they are? They are actually God's tears. When God is going to wipe away those tears, God is going to be wiping away God's tears. And it's not surprising to see that Heschel thinks and expresses himself in what we would call a kind of prophetic way here, in reacting to injustice and inequality among God's creatures. But what is a little eyebrow-raising is that the suffering becomes God's. So we're going to play this out here. But Heschel was interested in prophecy. And yet, the story of Heschel and prophecy is not quite so simple and not quite so linear. So I'm going to take us on what's going to seem like a little bit of an excursus right now, but I think it's crucially important for understanding something about the progression in Heschel's life. Among his early scholarly works, which began in Europe, among them were a biography of Maimonides, which was written in German. After he came to the United States in 1940, he wrote a few years later an article in Hebrew on Maimonides and prophecy. And he followed that with another Hebrew article on the phenomenon of prophecy generally in the Middle Ages. Now, this was long after what was supposed to have been the cessation of prophecy. The rabbis of the Talmud made it clear that prophecy was no longer, that maybe there could be a bat kol, a heavenly voice from time to time, and you won't really pay much attention to that either necessarily. But prophets who come and speak as if they have communed with God, no, that's gone. And here is Heschel writing about prophecy in the Middle Ages. So in these works, it's important to understand Heschel was not speaking of prophecy as a call to wipe God's tears away from the oppressed. He was talking of prophecy as what he called the gift of heavenly thought, of being able to connect to the thoughts of God. And he set forth the idea that one of the fundamentals of religion, as he saw it, was the ever-present possibility of this kind of personal revelation, of connecting with the divine mind. So the prophecy that he was writing about at that time was a communion with God's thoughts. It was contemplative. It was standing apart from the soiled moral landscape of the world and the streets of human society. And these studies of prophecy that I just mentioned, and they were, it should be noted, they were a window into the desires and aspirations of Heschel himself. They were not at all about preaching to the powerful, "Is this the fast I have chosen?" a famous prophecy that we read on Yom Kippur. We have no image here of a march in Selma and legs praying. This is the kind of prophecy that Maimonides insisted was possible still. Perhaps Maimonides even believed he had achieved it, and that was really the title of that article that Heschel wrote. And this is what fascinated Heschel enough to want to write about it, and to write about it more than once. So the reason that prophecy had allegedly ceased was not because it had really ceased for the reason that the rabbis long ago had said, that it was the sinfulness of the generations. Instead, it was the fact that the human condition in exile, the conditions and the vicissitudes of life, those burdens made it difficult, sometimes to the point of impossibility, for the soul to sufficiently loosen itself from the bonds of the body's physicality, to be able to join itself to God's thoughts. But the possibility of a revelation that provides that gift of heavenly thought, Heschel and the medievals he was studying believed it was always there in every age at all times. Now, what in Heschel's own life drew him to an aspiration of that kind of very private, very intensely personal mode of prophecy? So I think it was in part the legacy of his namesake, because his great-great-grandfather was the first Abraham Joshua Heschel, Avraham Yoshua Heschel of Apt. He was known as the Apter Rav, also known as the Ohev Yisrael, because that was a name of his most famous work. He died in 1825. And here's what the Heschel we are speaking about, what his ancestor had to say. A person must always see himself at every moment as if he is standing at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. And here comes the really important line. For humans are subject to past and future, but God is not. And each and every day, God gives the Torah to the people of Israel. Now, you understand what's being said here? Humans live in history. Humans live in the midst of things that are unfolding on the streets. But God is beyond history. God is beyond time. God is timeless. So the reason there cannot be a cessation of prophecy is because the main party, the divine, is not bound by time at all. It makes no sense to say God reveals himself before this date and not after that date. There are no dates for God. So it has to be available precisely because it's apart from time and thus apart from history. Now, I've deliberately started with this, what I could call a prehistory of Heschel's fascination with prophecy, because it's not an excursus. It's going to help us enormously in understanding what he had to say several decades later. And in fact, what I'm about to put up on the screen is among the last things that he spoke and wrote, and it was even published actually just a short time after his death. So here we go. Next text. The reasons for my involvement in the peace movement. And it's anthologized in Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity that was edited by his daughter in 1996, but it was actually published in the very early days of 1973, shortly after his death. Look what he says here. For many years, I lived by the conviction that my destiny is to serve in the realm of privacy, to be concerned with the ultimate issues, and involved in attempting to clarify them in thought and in word. Loneliness was both a burden and a blessing, and above all, indispensable for achieving a kind of stillness in which perplexities could be faced without fear. So here is the echo of that aspiration to prophecy decades earlier. He says that he thought it was his destiny to be in this quiet, private contemplation with the kind of insulation from the messiness of life that allows the soul to soar and to become privy to the gifts of the thoughts of heaven, to be reaching God's timeless thoughts, independent of the events, above the events on the timeline of earthly history. I don't believe that this aspiration and vision ever really left Heschel, but it had to make way for another understanding of prophecy, a very different understanding of prophecy that was, if anything, going to be even more powerful in his life. And that's what ensues in this text. So he said that was his conviction, that his destiny was to be in the realm of privacy. 3 events changed my attitude. One was the countless onslaughts upon my inner life, depriving me of the ability to sustain inner stillness. It's not easy to divorce yourself and be aloof from the things going on out in the street. The second event was the discovery, he doesn't say exactly how he discovered it, that indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. Why is indifference to evil worse than evil itself? The evildoer does evil. Those who are indifferent to evil project the message to one and all that evil can be gotten away with. And then he says, isolationism is frequently an unconscious pretext for carelessness, for not caring, whether among statesmen or among scholars. To be in that contemplative mode is not to care. And then he says, the third event that changed my attitude was my study of the prophets of Israel, on which he worked for several years until its publication in 1962. And that, of course, was the great book called The Prophets. And then he says, it's not up here right now, that the more deeply immersed he became in the thinking of the prophets, the more powerfully it became clear to him what the lives of the prophets sought to convey. That morally speaking, there's no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. How could you? Because it's the suffering of God. And we'll see that. It also became clear to me that in regard to cruelties committed in the name of a free society, here's a famous Heschel phrase, some are guilty while all are responsible. There are some evildoers, but those who are indifferent to evil are the ones who are truly responsible. So what we see here is now the sentiments of that poet of the 1930s who talked about wiping God's tears from the cheeks had now resurfaced again in the United States. So let's ask 2 questions here. First is, what did his study of the prophets of Israel reveal to him? What did he learn about prophecy from them that was so different from the view of prophecy that he had of this contemplative bliss that the medievals had yearned for. And then the second question was, what was it about his experiences in the United States that fostered this resurfacing of the emotional response to inequality and suffering, and the urge to, going back to the words of the poem, to kiss the fingernails of the downtrodden? What in his experience in the United States added power to this? So the next text is going to help us answer that first question of what he learned from the prophets. And this comes from exactly that book, The Prophets, published in 1962. Again, we'll just read some excerpts from it. We and the prophet have no language in common. One of the things Heschel had said is that prophets were people who spoke, as he put it, one octave too high. They came across as shrill. No one really wanted to listen to them. They were a bother. They were shrill. He says, to us, the moral state of society, for all its stains and spots, seems fair and trim. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's okay. It's livable. To the prophet, it's dreadful. So many deeds of charity are done. We say so much decency radiates day and night. Of course there is. There are people who volunteer. There are laws here and there that seem to make some inroads. Yet to the prophet, satiety of the conscience is prudery and flight from responsibility. Our standards are modest. Our sense of injustice, tolerable, timid. Our moral indignation, impermanent. Yet human violence is interminable, unbearable, permanent. And then a very important paragraph, skipping one here, the third paragraph. The prophet does not judge the people by timeless norms. Notice, remember timelessness? Remember what his ancestor had said, God is timeless? Prophet's not going into timelessness. The prophet is judging the people from the point of view of God, who suddenly is concerned with history here. Prophecy proclaims what happened, notice the past tense there, what happened to God, as well as what will happen to the people. Just to stop here for a moment, think about the ways in which we use the words prophet and prophecy. I'm not a prophet, I can't tell what's going to happen tomorrow. We think about prophecy as being future-oriented. The prophet's going to tell us what happens in the future, and sometimes they do that. Jeremiah warns the people that Babylonia is going to prevail. But the important thing for Heschel was not what will happen to the people. It's proclaiming what has already happened to God as a result of injustice in the world. This is the divine emotional life, God's feelings. In judging human affairs, it unfolds a divine situation. And here you see God's tears that are set forth now in prose, in addition to the poetry. Sin is not only the violation of a law, it's as if sin were as much a loss to God as to man. And so he goes on to say the style of legal objective utterance is alien to the prophet. He dwells upon God's inner motive, not only on his historical decisions. He discloses a divine pathos, not just a divine judgment. He's about God's inner feelings. And the pages of the prophetic writings are filled with echoes of divine love and disappointment, mercy and indignation. The God of Israel is never impersonal. In the next paragraph, which we won't read, I'll just summarize for you, but you have these texts. Heschel says, people sometimes say that we talk about God being merciful, God being kind, and all those things. We're just projecting human characteristics onto God. And he says, nonsense. Where have you ever seen humans described as all merciful, all caring, abundant in kindness, abundant in forgiveness, storing up merit for thousands generations? Those are God qualities. And it's not that we're projecting it onto God. We're trying to internalize something of what God is modeling for us. So that's part of that. What he learned from the prophets is that God suffers the way a parent suffers when the parent's children are being abused. And what's really stunning here is this kind of transformation. Remember, in the Middle Ages, there was this distrust of human reason. It can only take you thus far. So it led to the people aspiring to a contemplative prophecy, to kind of remove themselves from the world as much as possible, to have this intuitive sense of what the divine mind was, a non-rational, revelational connection to the divine. Now Heschel totally transforms it. What he distrusts is not human rationality. What Heschel now distrusts and says the prophets did was the human tendency to rationalize. I'm not a racist. This is not a racist country. My ancestors weren't even here when slavery existed. And all of the other rationalizations that make our moral indignation, as he puts it, impermanent, passing. We remember, as Rabbi Alexander pointed out, but we're not motivated to do anything about it because the feeling passes. It's impermanent. And this, as that previous text put it, is a description of what had to bring the scholar out of the study, that which he learned from the prophets of Israel. It had to bring him out of the seminar rooms into the arena where injustice was sadly and tragically always seemed to be having its day. So having now raised the issue of racism, which is, of course, the headline issue of this evening of study, we're now going to turn to the second question. Remember, that second question is, what was it in the United States and his experience here that kind of added fuel to this? We've gotten a glimpse of Heschel's immersion in the biblical prophets. That taught him something about human incorrigibility, the essential role of speaking for the God who suffers when God's children are abused. But what in the American landscape really activated this for Heschel? Well, he spoke about this most powerfully in the setting in which he first met Martin Luther King. It was January 1963. It was 7 months before the famous March on Washington. And a national conference on religion and race was held in Chicago. And our next text, which contains excerpts from Heschel's keynote address there, and by all accounts, it was a stem winder of a speech. It lays out for us the deep disappointments that were caused for him in the very nation that had taken him in and had spared his life. So we're going to look at some excerpts from that speech, Religion and Race. So he starts out with religion and race. How can the two be uttered together? To act in the spirit of religion is to unite what lies apart, to remember that humanity as a whole is God's beloved child. To act in the spirit of race is to sunder, to slash, to dismember the flesh of living humanity, to treat it as if it's a composite of different things and not all God's children collectively. Is this the way to honor a father, to torture his child? How can we hear the word race and feel no self-reproach? Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal and evil racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking. And then this beautiful line, what is an idol? You want to know what idolatry is? Any God who is mine but not yours, any God concerned with me but not with you, is an idol. Faith in God's not simply an afterlife insurance policy. It's not doing what you do in order to get to the next world. Racial or religious bigotry must be recognized for what it is: Satanism and blasphemy. Those are tough, tough words. So the first thing he does in this speech is establish that even thinking in racial terms, let alone acting cruelly on those terms, and even being indifferent to those who are acting cruelly on racial terms, all of that is a denial of God's sovereignty over all of creation. It's idolatry. It may be worse. It may be blasphemy. And then he gets to what he sadly encountered in the America that he had embraced. This fifth paragraph here. There is a form of oppression which is more painful and more scathing than physical injury or economic privation. It is public humiliation. Listen to what he says next. What afflicts my conscience is that my face, Heschel's face, the face of a man who was saved from genocide in Europe, but whose skin is white, whose skin happens not to be dark, instead of radiating the likeness of God, has come to be taken as an image of haughty assumption and overbearance. He's not arguing against that. He understands why it's seen that way. Whether justified or not, in terms of what I feel, I've become in the eyes of others a symbol of arrogance and pretension, my very presence inflicting insult. And this is now where he expresses that conviction that we saw before, that indifference to evil can be worse than evil itself. He turns inward, soul searching. How long will I continue to be tolerant of, even a participant in acts of embarrassing and humiliating human beings in restaurants, hotels, buses, parks, employment agencies, public schools, and universities, where I am allowed in through the front door and others are being held back? One ought rather be shamed than to put others to shame. By negligence and silence, we've all become accessory before the God of mercy to the injustice committed against the Negroes by men of our nation. We have failed to demand, to insist, to challenge, and to chastise. And most notably, Heschel, who was an immigrant from Poland and Germany, then turns to one of the American founders for a truly prophetic warning. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. I gave you the fuller quote of Jefferson here, which you can look at your leisure. He says, the conscience builds its confines, is subject to fatigue, longs for comfort. We have a million rationalizations to keep us from doing anything. But you know what, he says, those who are hurt, and he, God, who inhabits eternity, they neither slumber nor sleep. God doesn't slumber or sleep because he's God. Those who are hurt don't slumber or sleep because they're deprived of sleep by their suffering. And the prophet's great contribution to humanity was the discovery of the evil of indifference. One may be decent and sinister, pious and sinful. The universe, he says, is done, the greater masterpiece still undone. And God's needs cannot be satisfied in space by sitting in pews, by visiting temples, only in history and time. Notice this transformation of the timeless God that we're trying to connect to, one mode of prophecy. Now he's in a totally different place because of what he's experienced. And it is within the realm of history that man is charged with God's mission. What have I done today, we have to ask ourselves, to alleviate the anguish, to mitigate the evil, and to prevent humiliation? Now, 13 months later, it was in February 1964, Heschel addressed the Metropolitan Conference on Religion and Race in New York. This wasn't a national conference, it was a local one. His talk there was entitled The White Man on Trial. And I'm going to give you just a short excerpt from it, and you're going to hear Heschel. He's going to sarcastically portray the impatience of white America with the protests and demands of Black America. He's going to portray that by comparing those protests to the murmurings of the Israelites in the wilderness. A rather remarkable portrayal, which I will put up now. Here's from The White Man on Trial, and you have to, it drips with sarcasm. I'll try to give you that in my voice. The Negroes of America behaved just like the children of Israel. Only in 1963, last year, they experienced the miracle of having turned the tide of history, the joy of finding millions of Americans involved in the struggle for civil rights. By the way, the Civil Rights Bill hadn't even passed yet. The exaltation of French fellowship, the March to Washington, Now, only a few months later, they have the audacity to murmur, what shall we drink? We want adequate education, decent housing, proper employment. How ordinary, how unpoetic, how annoying. He might have said, how ungrateful. Life could be so pleasant. The Beatles have just paid us a visit. AT&T is about to split its stock. Dividends are higher than ever. Castro is quiet and well-mannered. No problems from Cuba this year. Russia is purchasing grain from us. Only the Negroes continue to disturb us. What shall we drink? That prosaic demand for housing without vermin, for adequate schools, for adequate employment, sounds so trite, so drab, so banal, so devoid of magnificence. And Heschel then caps this with the crucial observation that he now knows that God is not concerned with lofty heavenly thoughts. God is not interested in giving us the gift of God's thoughts. Devarim she'omdim berumo shalom, things that stand on the highest levels in the world. Rather, God is concerned with the common deed, the theology of the common deed. God is concerned with everydayness, with the trivialities of life, which of course are not trivial at all, but that we consider to be trivial when it's other people who are asking for them. Now, in Heschel's long work, which Rabbi Andelman referenced, on the theological trunk lines of Jewish thought, Torah min hashamayim, which I had the privilege of translating, he devotes a chapter near the end of the 3-volume work to the sad but inescapable fact that morally grotesque features of society can nevertheless hide behind the cloak of legality. That was, by the way, exactly what the Talmudic rabbis long ago had said was the ultimate perversity of Sodom, the city of Sodom, and all societies like it. What was their real perversity? It wasn't what the Bible depicts. The real perversity of Sodom to the rabbis was that the law was either formulated to be discriminatory or, more usually, was administered in such a way as to be discriminatory and oppressive. So it was all legal, but still grotesque. A person can be pious and sinister, as you saw Heschel already said. And here are a couple of excerpts from that work, Torah min hashamayim, where he lays this out. It is a chapter called A Scoundrel Within the Bounds of the Torah. He says, fourth line here. Does the Torah contain but one mode of thought, the legal mode? Is there no room for the mode of mercy, that which commands action beyond the legal boundary? Does the Torah give us no life values other than those of kosher and unkosher? Do we not need to take account of the values of pleasantness and righteousness? If according to Nachmanides, that's Moshe ben Nachman, a person may be a scoundrel within the bounds of the Torah, that's his phrase from which he gets the chapter title. If that's true, then it's implied that there must be another path beyond the line of the halakha. The sages declared that Jerusalem was destroyed only because they judged solely by the Torah's law and did not act beyond the line of the law. A remarkable statement that one could be entirely observant of the laws of the Torah, the legal line, and still be doing injustice. There's more here that you can look at, but I want to give you a current example of this. It's one of many. Put aside for the moment any judgment on the police officers who were the proximate cause of Breonna Taylor's death in Louisville last year. Think instead about the laws that made this almost inevitable. One of those laws allowed for a no-knock warrant, applied across the board to everyone, not discriminatory, maybe unwise, but not discriminatory. And then there are lenient laws in Kentucky, as in so many other places in America, that in effect encourage the possession of firearms, by civilians like Breonna Taylor's boyfriend. He was entitled to own firearms, and he was entitled to use them, of course, in self-defense. Now, finally, of course, there is the obvious law that allows police officers to return fire if they are fired upon while carrying out a legal operation. Now, take all of these laws together and ask yourself whether Breonna Taylor ever had a chance to survive once that no-knock warrant was signed pursuant to law. It emerges that once it was signed, it was inevitably a death sentence for one or more of the people in that home, because they would be invaded. It was a no-knock warrant. They wouldn't know why. They would naturally shoot back because they're entitled to do so when they're invaded. And then they would be felled by the greater firepower of the police. So seen in this way, Breonna Taylor and so many others like her was not so much killed by police officers as she was killed by the law itself, killed by a society whose systemic injustices we tolerate because they seem not to affect us very much. Now, the laws in question are not discriminatory on their surface. They apply to everyone. They're not Nuremberg laws, but still one has to wonder, how many judges have actually signed off in Kentucky on those kinds of warrants for neighborhoods other than those of people of color? So you know what? Actually, we don't have to wonder about that because studies have already shown there and in other places how discriminatory the law is in its application. Not so different from what the rabbis imagined was the systemic injustice in Sodom. The proximate cause of the death of Breonna Taylor may have been a bullet from a police firearm, but the efficient cause was the way in which the system habitually applied its laws. So back to Heschel, who saw all of this before his eyes in America. We go back to Torah Min HaShamayim for a few more lines. He says, we can enforce the line of the law, but not what lies beyond the line of the law. That's going to be in the human heart. The law is manifest, it's fixed, it's constant. But that which lies beyond the line of the law is not explicit, it's subjective, and it's given to discretion. How will that discretion be used? And so he says now the agadic element of halakha, that which goes beyond the line of halakha and tells us in a kind of, in a religious narrative of what is right and proper and merciful, that brings about a widening of one's field of vision and an expansion of horizons. Halachic masters are not usually attentive to the depths of life, that is, to the life that plays out within a person's soul. And against those who complain about the tradition shackles, there's no one to explicate its grand vision. So here he is turning his preaching not just to people who need to act prophetically, but he's turning his preaching also to the legalists, to the halachists. Where are those who would broaden the base and thus raise the edifice even higher and make the law truly into an instrument of justice and not, God forbid, unwittingly, unintentionally, into an instrument of injustice? One of Heschel's favorite midrashim was the one about how Abraham arrived at his certainty that there's a God who's concerned with the world. It's Rabbi Isaac said, Abraham is like a man who was traveling from place to place. He saw a palace in flames and he says, is it possible no one cares about this? The owner of the palace then looked out and said, I'm the owner. And similarly, Abraham, our father, wondered, is it conceivable that the world which is in flames is without a guide? And the Holy One looked out and said, I'm the guide. I'm the sovereign of the world. The world is in flames, consumed by evil. Is it possible there's no one who cares? Asks Heschel. God needs us to care. And here he is updating and transforming the argument that his ancestor had given for why prophecy can never cease. Remember what the elder Abraham Yoshua Heschel had said? Prophecy can't cease because God is timeless. The connection to the divine can't be controlled, started, or stopped by events on earth. Heschel now found in this midrash the alternative answer to why prophecy need never cease, and in fact must never cease. It's precisely because of events on earth in history. It's precisely because events cause the God of pathos to weep and to need our action among God's creatures. That's why Heschel said to the Rabbinical Assembly in 1968, when Martin Luther King appeared at that convention, that he considered King to be a prophet and the sign that God had not abandoned the United States. And King, for his part, returned the compliment to Heschel. King was murdered 10 days after that. Heschel died just over 4.5 years later. The premature exit from the stage of history of these two prophetic voices against racism makes this final little piece I want to share with you even more poignant than it otherwise would be. It's an autobiographical fragment. Heschel gives us a little narrative about his own youth, but then it's followed by a one-line melancholy reflection of a mature but deeply disappointed adult. Here we are. The experience of a child of 7 who is reading in school the chapter which tells of the sacrifice of Isaac on the way to Mount Moriah with his father. He lay on the altar, bound, waiting to be sacrificed. My heart began to beat even faster. It actually sobbed with pity for Isaac. Behold, Abraham now lifted the knife, and now my heart froze within me with fright. And suddenly the voice of the angel was heard, Abraham, lay not your hand upon the lad, for now I know that you fear God. And here I broke out in tears and wept aloud. Why are you crying? Asked the rabbi. You know that Isaac was not killed. And I said to him, still weeping, but Rabbi, supposing the angel had come a second too late. The rabbi comforted me and calmed me by telling me that an angel cannot come late. And here comes the reflection of the adult man, the adult rabbi, who had seen way too much human indifference. An angel cannot be late, but man, made of flesh and blood, may be. And that, I think, is a place to stop here. We have a few more minutes, I think maybe 4 more minutes to 8:37. Maybe they'll even be a little kinder to us with another minute or two if there are questions that someone would like to ask.
Great, thank you. All right, so friends, feel free to submit questions in the chat to me, and I will share them with Rabbi Tucker. I'll ask you a question in the meantime, if that's okay, while we're waiting.
Sure.
Do you think that we, how do you think Heschel would feel about the extent to which we have or haven't internalized his messages on racial justice, and like what kind of grade would he give us in the Jewish community?
I'm afraid he'd give us a horrible grade, right? Now, if he were around, if he hadn't died, at still a relatively young age, only 65, if he had lived another 30 years into the 21st century, maybe his presence would have made something of a difference. But the systemic racism that not only exists but is denied day in and day out by political leaders who just deny it when it's right in front of them, would I think just create enormous sadness for him. And in the last interview he gave, that famous interview with Carl Stern, which also aired after he died, Carl Stern asked him, so looking around the world today, are you an optimist? And Heschel's response was, I am an optimist against my better judgment. That is, I'm a rabbi. I'm supposed to be an optimist. I have to give people hope. But you want to know something? It's kind of hard. And I think that's what he would sense and feel today. They're giving us 45 seconds here, folks. So I'm putting in the link to the Ohev Yisrael that I read, if anyone wants it. Giving it to Julia, because I don't see exactly how to give it to everybody. So.
Great. Yeah, we just have half a minute left. I don't know if you want to, if there's anything final you want to add.
No, I hope that I gave you a sense of Heschel always was about dualities, and he came from this Hasidic milieu and this mystical milieu, and the connecting to God in that contemplative way, I think, never left him. But his experiences in the world brought out, and his study of the prophets converged to create